Hi, my name's Dan, and this video is one in a series of videos I'm doing about designing enemies for video games, which is part of a larger suite of videos on the topics of game design. And in this one, I'm going to talk about the question of how do you assess how tough or how difficult an enemy is. And it's not the most straightforward question. Uh, there, obviously, you are able to get a rough idea very quickly of how difficult an enemy is, but um, actually getting that kind of nailed down to quite a precise figure or amount. You know, if you've got an RPG, you might be wanting to assign levels to your enemies. Um, then there are some difficulties involved in this concept. So the first thing I'm going to think about is what do we actually mean by difficult? And so there are several different ways you might measure the difficulty of a enemy in a game. So here we go. The most basic question is, if the player faces up to the enemy, who's going to win? And that might be predictable. There might be situations in which you know for sure that the player's going to win. If you've got a particularly easy enemy, or you know you're pretty confident that the enemy's going to win. It may be that, however, that the player dies the first time they face an enemy, and then they learn how to deal with it. So, how many attempts does it take the player to kill the enemy? So this is obviously more useful for harder enemies where you're probably going to lose the first time that you attack them. Another way of potentially measuring that is how many health potions is it going to take the player to use up in the process of dealing with this enemy. So can they defeat it if if you stock them up with 100 health potions, even against a really tough enemy, they may have the chance to be able to deal with it. So that could be a measure. However, there's always enemies that you cannot deal with, regardless of how many health potions you have. So moving on, if the player wins, generally you still might want to know what the difficulty of the enemy is, of course. So if it's fairly guaranteed that the player's going to win, there are two ways of ascertaining what the difficulty of the enemy is. One is how long does it take the player to take down the enemy. So if it's it might take them 10 seconds, which is a reasonable length fight. If they're one hit, then obviously this is the thing that they're facing is pretty weak. Or another way is to assess how much damage does the player take from the enemy while they're in the process of defeating that enemy. And this is one of my favourite ways of thinking about difficulty for enemies, which is either doing it in this way or think about how many of this enemy could the player take on one at a time, one after the other, until the player died. So, say you're in the standard situation of having giant rats at the beginning of a fantasy game, and you've got your starting player. On average, for the average player, how many rats should they be able to kill before they themselves are killed, or before they have to stop and get some health potions to build themselves back up again? So all this is not straightforward, and everything here depends on all sorts of things as well, because obviously players vary in their skill level and the way that they approach combat. Different enemies may be easier to some players than some other enemies are, depending on their tactics that they prefer. There may be particular difficulties for some players if defeating their enemies is very dependent on hand-eye coordination, for example. So there are players who can learn like the what sometimes is called the muscle memory of how to do combat in games and get expertise and fast reactions, but actually um, getting better in general at hand-eye coordination isn't something that comes very easily, and there are some players in particular that seem to struggle with these things. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk about the what I'm calling the multiple enemy equation, which is how much damage does the player take when they're facing multiple enemies of the same type. And I want to explain to you there's a particular way of working this out. There are some complications with it, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So here we've got a very, very basic game. We've got the blue blob is the mighty blue blob is the player, and the nefarious orange blob is the enemy. And the player is attacking the enemy, and the enemy is also attacking the player. And on average, we've run several different combats to get this average. On average, the player loses 10 hit points whilst killing the orange blob. Okay, fine. So how much damage are they going to take when they face two enemy orange blobs, nefarious orange blobs? And the instinct first says, well, surely that's going to be 20, isn't it? Because you've got two enemies. That's not the case, because this is what happens. So whilst the player fights the first enemy, in the process of defeating the first enemy, he is taking damage from two enemies at the same time. So if when he was fighting one enemy, he lost 10 hit points, or she lost 10 hit points whilst they were defeating that enemy. If there are two enemies on, whilst they're defeating the first of those enemies, they will take 20 hit points of damage. And then, once that first enemy is dead, they will then take 10 hit points while fighting the second blob. That should say second blob. I just cut and paste and it says first blob. And you get a small window into the professionalism that I have when I'm creating these videos. So sorry about that. So the total there is 30 hit points, and it's as if you were fighting three in a row. Now, I did say that there were complications with this because this is kind of a worst case scenario, really. Potentially depending on the enemies. So if the enemies have got any way of working together, then it could actually be worse than that. If your player is completely stupid and hits the enemies alternately, so hit enemy one, then hit enemy two, and is doing damage to them equally, that's not a good tactic. They'll take 40 hit points of damage whilst fighting these two enemies. If the player has the ability to do area of effect damage, then they can shorten these things. If they've got the ability to put one to sleep whilst they fight the other one, or any other kind of crowd control with that, then they can make a better situation than that. But in the very, very basics situation, two enemies at the same time is equivalent to facing three of the same enemies, one after another. And you can see that from the fact that it's 30 hit points here, and one enemy does 10 hit points of damage. And the equivalence of this, there's the maths of this is that if you have two altogether, it's equivalent to three, one at a time. If you have three altogether, it's equivalent to six, one at a time. And it's the sum of, and you can see why it's the sum of 3 plus 2 plus 1. And then for 4, it's the sum of 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, which is 10. And for a generalized number n, we're using algebra here, sorry about that, then it's n times n plus 1 divided by 2, which is how you do the sum of the first n numbers. So for 10 enemies at a time, you would have, that'd be, 10 enemies altogether, that's equivalent to 55, one at a time. So swarming enemies on the player can be very effective and gives you a certain difficulty. But that's, the reason why I'm talking about that is because multiple enemies and think about difficulty of encounters is something that comes into this equation of what we're doing. Okay. So there are several ways to test the difficulty of enemies, and to some extent, none of them are perfect. And you'll see the middle one is probably the best one. So there's paper testing. You could do drawing things out using dice rolls, using anything that you can do to actually just simulate the combat without actually having to program it to see what happens. You've got actual playtesting, which is when you get enough of the game in play to get players in front of it. And of course, designers are brilliantly good at playing all games. um, but yes, getting a variety of testers to play. So I don't know for sure that anybody does this, but I would think it was a very useful thing to do if you had public beta testing to actually get telemetry, or the equivalent of telemetry from cars, to collect data from a large number of players when they're facing enemies, and from that to reverse engineer that data to work out the difficulty of the enemies that you've got, and to so you're able to tweak that as you go towards your main release. And then something that I know that some companies have tried and are doing, you could also do automated playtesting. So the advantage of automated playtesting, basically, this is where you create an AI bot to be the player who will play against effectively the AI bots that are the enemies. And you get them to do multiple scenarios and multiple runs of combat, and you don't need a person to actually do that. And in fact, if you uh, depending on how you approach it, it's possible to speed up the process as well, because you can just bring your timing for everything down and sort of shrink it so you get your results better. Um, the biggest problem here is actually creating uh, bots that are realistic enough to mimic player behavior and to mimic the spread of players that you might have. Um, but it's an interesting topic of exploration. Actually, as automated playtesting, it's something I'm particularly interested in. Anyway, so that's been a run through some of the thoughts about the complications of what it means to try and work out how difficult an enemy is. There will always be certain enemies that certain players find particularly or unusually difficult, because players are hugely inventive in the ways that they find to be different from other players. Um, but that's it from me for now.